Hello, and welcome to our viewers in the United States and Europe. I'm Katja Donovan, Executive Director of 1014, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our transatlantic conversation titled Shattered Illusions and Today's Geopolitical Realities. This event is organized by 1014 and the American Council on Germany.
And I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. I think it's fair to say that on Saturday, October 7th, we all woke up to the shocking news about the violent attacks by Hamas in Gaza. This escalation of violence in Israel and Gaza has dashed hopes for peace in the Middle East, at least in the short term. But it also calls into question the hopes for stability, peace, and prosperity that people had after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as well as the so-called Arab Spring. The peace dividend at this point has been spent, and we're seeing open conflict in Ukraine and Gaza. Some even consider these conflicts to be proxy wars, pitting democracies against authoritarian regimes. Today, we'd like to talk about the situation in Gaza, the response of the international community, the danger of further escalation, but we also want to take a step back and put all of this in a broader geopolitical context. And I can hardly think of two better observers of world affairs for today's discussion than the two journalists who are with us today, Anna Sauerbrey and Steven Erlanger. Anna is the foreign editor at the weekly DIE ZEIT, and before that, she served as the head of the opinion pages at Der Tagesspiegel in Berlin, and Tagesspiegel Causa. It's the online magazine. And in 2018, she was awarded a Kellen Fellowship by the ACG. Anna, it's always great to see you. Herzlich willkommen. And Steve Erlanger is the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. He's held this position since 2017. And as of this summer, he's back in Berlin. In his career, he served as bureau chief in London, Paris, Jerusalem, Berlin, Prague, Moscow, Bangkok. Steve, the list is almost endless, but I really want to thank you as well for being with us today. We are looking forward to hearing from both of you in terms of your observations and analysis of the current situation.
But before we get started, we would like to remind everyone that the American Council on Germany and 1014 are both independent and nonpartisan organizations. So the views expressed during these conversations are to those of our two guests. Also, to our viewers, if you'd like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. Let us know who your question is directed to, and we will do our best to integrate your questions into the conversation.
So, Steve, let's maybe start with you. You just returned to Berlin after reporting from Jerusalem, and I think it would be really interesting for all of us to hear some of your impressions from having been on the ground in Israel shortly after the attacks just over 2 weeks ago.
Well, thank you, Steve, and Katja, and Anna too. Yeah, I was, bureau chief there. I've covered everything from the 1983 withdrawal from the Awali River in southern Lebanon to intifadas to the last, 3 or 4 big Gaza incursions from inside Gaza. That didn't happen this time. Very few, I don't think any Westerners have gotten into Gaza since this happened, but I wrote a story the first night, October 7th. I flew to Israel the next day and have been racing around since and basically took a break. What we have is a charnel house. When I go there at moments like this, I feel like a mortician. The number of dead on the Israeli side is unprecedented. It was 1,400 people, nearly all of them civilians, murdered in their homes, murdered in Israel proper, not in any settlement, but within Israel. And in return, Israel's been pounding the hell out of Gaza by air, the biggest air bombing campaign in Gaza in my memory. And so when people say, oh, well, the ground incursion hasn't yet begun, I mean, the war began right away and it continues. And also Israel is going in on the ground. It's doing it, I think, in a much more sensible way, which is raids based on intelligence. There was another pretty big one last night. But anyone who thinks this is like a previous Gaza incursion just misunderstands what happened to Israel, what happened to the Israeli spirit, what happened to the Israeli army, and what happened to Israeli politics. And what you have is obviously what's going on in Gaza is very difficult to watch. But Hamas, I've been in Gaza during these conflicts. Hamas has tunnels, miles and miles and miles of tunnels underground. It stores weapons in hospitals, in mosques, in people's houses. It does not separate itself from civilians. It's what Mao used to call swimming in the sea. And so it's a very difficult fight for the Israelis. If they do intend, as they say, to dismantle Hamas's power in Gaza, they can't kill Hamas. Obviously, Hamas is a religiously based ideology, which, first of all, doesn't recognize the right of Israel to exist, but secondly, is trying to raise the issue more correctly of what happens to Palestinians and Palestinian liberation and the Palestinian question. If they can go and dismantle Hamas, the question then is the constant political one. What do you do with Gaza? If Hamas isn't ruling Gaza, who does rule it? I'm not sure there's an answer. There are a lot of people with a lot of kind of weak views, but this is one of the great outstanding questions. I will end just by saying, if Israel does succeed in dismantling Hamas's power over Gaza and doesn't succeed in creating through some kind of political settlement a quiet border with Gaza, then it is very hard to say Israel has succeeded.
Maybe one quick follow-up to Steve, and then I'd like to bring Anna into the conversation. Steve, you and I actually had the opportunity to speak on September 11th of this year, and we started our conversation reflecting back on 9/11. You were Berlin bureau chief at the time, and I thought it was interesting as you were talking just now about how important it is to try to understand what happened to Israel. A number of people have been making comparisons between these attacks on October 7th and what's happened since with 9/11 because of the scope of the impact, because of the surprise that it's had. How and even Netanyahu talked about this being Israel's 9/11 moment. How realistic do you think this comparison is?
Well, it's realistic in terms of the shock, but Osama bin Laden didn't live in Canada or Mexico. I mean, it's not next door, right? And what he did, I think most people would agree, would be very hard to replicate. But the Americans took, well, with NATO's help and so on, spent 10 years and hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, and failed, of course, in the end, but certainly killed Osama bin Laden. So in this sense, I think Israel uses 9/11 as a way to say, look, we have the right to defend ourselves, first of all. Look what the Americans did. But I think the real comparison is actually with the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Israel, full of hubris and complacency and self-confidence, and it had patronized Arab armies since 1967, was totally taken by surprise when Anwar Sadat crossed the canal and nearly destroyed Israel. Now, Israel, in the end, managed to win the war, but it was an incredible embarrassment to the intelligence, to the military, to the government, and in the end, those responsible all had to resign. And I think that's a better comparison, frankly.
Thank you. Anna, let's bring you into this conversation. Steve was just talking about the massive intelligence failure, and I think that's certainly something that has been surprising people on both sides of the Atlantic, that Israeli authorities didn't see this coming, even that Western intelligence agencies did not seem to anticipate this. Have you been sort of following the intelligence failure as part of your assessment and analysis of the situation?
No, not so much, though it seems like in Germany, everybody was just as surprised as the Israelis. And I think in Germany, too, just as in the United States, the government, the foreign ministry had hoped that it would not have to deal with this conflict anytime soon again. We have not seen any major Western initiatives to pick up on the peace process. And just like Americans, Germans have watched it from afar, have watched things developed, have done the usual, or given the usual humanitarian aid, particularly to the Palestinian side, some weapons aid, some weapons contracts with Israel, but hoping that this would somehow stay on the level of conflict, on the level of tensions that we have seen in the past. And I don't think that anybody here in Germany, at least, anticipated what has happened now.
Let me actually jump right in here, and we might pivot back to another question. But you just said, nobody was prepared for this or was surprised for this. And I think you're both in your pieces that you wrote, you alluded to some of the assumptions that in our official Western approaches towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that some of them now seem to like been crushed and have proven wrong. So, Steven, you wrote a piece in the New York Times that defined some of these, that explained some of these assumptions. Could you maybe explain a little bit
Sure.
of what has gone wrong and why that has gone wrong, in your opinion?
So, I think first thing that went wrong was Benjamin Netanyahu's long belief that he could keep Hamas contained inside Gaza. Israel was never naive about Hamas, but he thought he could keep it contained, weaken the Palestinian Authority, which is dominated by Hamas's rival Fatah, which is mostly in the West Bank. And if you keep the Palestinians divided, you don't have to make peace with them. This was Bibi's view. That was his strategy. And that was why he let Qatar give lots of money to prop up Hamas, why he issued work permits for Gazans in differing numbers, depending on the situation, to enter Israel to work, on the assumption that Hamas would be so busy ruling Gaza that it might moderate itself. But that was a deep misunderstanding of Hamas, which is actually, the military wing of Hamas is quite separate from the political wing, and actually is more important. And then there's a secretive shura that runs Hamas, and we don't even know who these people are. So that was a big misconception. Another huge misconception, I think, which the Americans shared too, was that Israel was this fact of life and it was this technological wonder, and the Sunni states, the Saudis, the Gulfis, would want to have a relationship with Israel. And in fact, that was the push. That was the push of the Abraham Accords, and the Americans have been helping Israel and Saudis try to work out some kind of normalization, actually, in return for defense guarantees from the United States and some civil nuclear technology. But always it was, well, where's the Palestinian question in all this? It was put to the side. It was considered, it was deprioritized. Well, Hamas has just put it back on the table in a very big, bloody way. And it's a problem for all these Sunni states. They hate Hamas, they hate the Muslim Brotherhood, they hate radical Islam. And now, because of popular anger, in a way, they have to balance. And it's a very difficult thing to balance in this passionate world. So, you know, that's one of them. And the last one I would just say briefly, America has been giving platitudes for a long time about the two-state solution and how settlements in the West Bank by Israel were a bad thing and didn't help the peace process. But these were platitudes and nothing was being done. And frankly, now I think this notion that the Americans could stay out of the Middle East and concentrate on China or concentrate on Ukraine, well, that's been blown out of the water too. Those are three of them anyway.
Thank you so much, Steven. Anna, you also wrote a piece in Die ZEIT, and you explained the policies, the Western policies towards the Middle East. You mentioned the Abraham Accords between Israel and the Arab Emirates and Gulf states. And you kind of alluded that maybe leaving the Palestinian question out is also has been wishful thinking. So do you share Steven's assessment? And then also from a European point of view, what's your assessment about the European Union's reaction to it? And of course, Germany's reaction to the conflict?
I would, of course, never contradict Steven because he has much more expertise in the region than I do. But yes, I mean, the United States, the United States or the Biden administration has basically continued the Trump administration's policies of trying to foster more, well, if not peace, then a normalization of relations between the Arab world and particularly the Gulf states and Israel with the Abraham Accords. You mentioned them with Bahrain and United Emirates, and now was hoping for a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I guess the calculus was that if you create a more relaxed and a more normal environment around the conflict between Palestine and Israel, that would somewhat help to, well, deconflict this question too. But I mean, I think at the basis, this is a territorial conflict, and the territorial conflict has never come to a standstill. On the contrary, but Benjamin Netanyahu, especially with this new far-right government, has created more settlements in the West Bank and has allowed for more settlers to move there and to stock up the houses already existing in some of the settlements. So this has not been on hold as much as the German government, the American government, and other governments may have wished for. And the same thing for Gaza. The humanitarian situation is extremely dire now, but it has been extremely dire for years, as Steven and other correspondents who were able to travel to the region keep reporting. So these tensions were there. And this is not to say or not to in any way justify the violence that we have now seen, which is, of course, absolutely unjustifiable. But I think it somewhat explains why more diplomatic effort should have been put into this. Though, of course, it's fair to say, or you should mention too, that nobody really has a good solution. But the United States, being like the largest donor of military aid to Israel, would have had some leverage, of course, on the Israeli government at least.
Can I ask?
Yes.
Right. I just wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, I mean, just to try to explain the agony the EU's been going through in the last week or so. I mean, I'd like to understand it better too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think it was a very embarrassing reaction, and also to me a very disappointing reaction. We have seen a unified European Union reacting as a truly geopolitical European Union, as Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, likes to frame it in the case of the war or Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. And now it has been the reverse. The EU has been very split on many issues. It has given many very different statements and directions in its reactions to the conflict. And I think it's both split institutionally and, of course, among the member states. So we have some member states like Germany, but also some of the Middle and Eastern European member states like Hungary, Slovakia, who are have very close relations with Israel. Of course, Germany having the most special relationship with Israel, Israel's security, as many now have proclaimed again as Germany's Staatsräson, reason of state. And there are many other countries who see just like that. And then we have other countries such as Spain or Ireland who have a tradition of sympathizing with the Palestinian cause and defending it. Then we have the European institutions who are one of the largest donors of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian territories, particularly also to Gaza, but also to the West Bank. And we have a split in the institutions with von der Leyen, who of course brings the German tradition to the job, and I think just couldn't get out of her German skin in the first days. She also thought that the European Union should react very swiftly, so she was one of the first foreign officials to travel to Israel. And on the other side, we have Charles Michel and the European External Action Service, who were very critical from the beginning of Israel's military operations, calling for restraint, basically in their first statement, trying to come to a common statement with other Arab states during the Cairo Peace Conference. And yeah, it's just a state of confusion, and we see that within the institutions too. I think there was an open letter even to von der Leyen by several hundred officials in the Commission administration, which is a very unusual thing to see because these are not political appointees. These are really just public servants. And I think that sort of shows how much of an uproar there is with both within the institutions and among the member states who just had a very difficult summit.
So just, yeah, but there was a common statement out of the summit, and, was careful studying the language, you can see that it strikes exactly the balance between the camps you just described. So can you just comment on this statement very briefly? It speaks of a humanitarian process, and I know the chancellor even said, let's not haggle about words that much, and make sure that we don't lose sight of that there's urgent action needed. Do you have any comments to that statement, and maybe to the EU as a broker, or to Germany's potential role as a broker?
Yeah, I think it is interesting to look at the language, because it all came down to a plural or not a plural in the word pause, because I think what the German government really pushed for, and what Annalena Baerbock has also pushed for on the Cairo summit, is that Germany will not call for a ceasefire. A call for a ceasefire here in Germany is seen basically as a call to give Hamas the chance to rebuild its forces. It is seen as something that will be very negatively affect Israel's military operation on the ground. So a pause for Germans comes down to the call for a ceasefire. So they really made a point of just calling for pauses, that is brief interruptions of fighting, to give people in the Gaza Strip the chance to go to different places, to move further south, to try to find some security. And I think it's good that the European Union did come to a common solution, but from what we've heard here, it really was quite difficult.
Yeah, if I could say, the White House has also been very, very strict to say no ceasefire.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, humanitarian aid. The Israelis are saying, okay, bits and pieces, but not fuel, because Hamas uses the fuel. It's like, it's a war. I mean, I think people don't understand that it's a war, right? I mean, and this is part of the problem for all the sympathies one has. And I have a lot of friends inside Gaza, right? I mean, I have a lot of friends in Russia. I have a lot of friends in Ukraine. I mean, being a victim is a horrible thing, but it doesn't always mean that you're right. And a lot of the Palestinian civilians have been victims of Hamas for quite a long time now. And one has to feel miserable because, you know, there are Israelis who say, well, why don't they just do something about it and overthrow Hamas, which is a very naive thing to say. They're stuck, and they're stuck with the consequences of a war that, who knows, certainly 85% of Gazans would never have wished for. So it's one of those moral messes, and you know, I don't think anybody has a very happy answer for it, but a ceasefire is just not going to happen. And, you know, usually on these things, the Americans hold the clock, right? I mean, when the pain in Gaza, when the deaths of civilians get to be too much, the Americans say to the Israelis, okay, Ganuk, it's enough, right? But I think this time the watch is going to be in the pocket longer, given what Hamas did to Israel, which was really unprecedented. Already you see the American influence on Israeli actions. They've slowed things down. They've agreed to at least some kind of aid coming in from Egypt. But I'm also very struck by the Egyptians and Jordanians who have no interest in opening up Gaza. They don't care about Gaza. Mm-hmm. They certainly don't want the Gazans coming to Egypt, let alone Jordan. Sisi's been trying to eliminate radical Islamists in the Sinai ever since he got into office. He has no interest in importing Hamas. So, you know, the Gazans are an orphan, and it's a sad orphan, and they're an orphan of the Arab world as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, Steve, as you were describing this, right? I mean, it's obviously a war, and as Anna pointed out too, we're seeing huge, you know, on both sides, huge humanitarian crises as well, and this sort of leads to another sort of thread of questions that I think we've all been asking, but particularly when we look at Germany, sort of how is this tension playing out? Several of our viewers have asked if they could hear a little bit more about how you see Germany, how you see Berlin balancing these two issues. One is supporting Israel, and that is largely due to the Holocaust in a sense of responsibility and moral responsibility. But then also this incredible humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza. And we're seeing this play out, you know, on the streets of German cities as well, but not just there. I mean, we're seeing it on college campuses in the US. This is becoming an incredibly divisive topic. And so, you know, you're both in Berlin now. Anna, you've been in Berlin throughout this period. I'd be really interested in hearing from you first, sort of how does one come to terms with these two very different perspectives and viewpoints? How does one try to reconcile them?
Well, I think at the moment there is no way of reconciling them. It's a very divisive topic in Germany, and it's it's also a great division between what we hear from the German government and what we see happening in German society. So the German government has been unwavering and unanimous in its support of Israel. We haven't even heard from Chancellor Scholz or anybody else in the German government any calls for restraint, something that we have now heard a little more from Biden administration's officials and Biden himself. You won't hear that from the German government. And at the same time, what plays out in Germany's streets and also among intellectuals, civil society actors, is really just a very divisive and controversial discussion on whether this reaction is the right reaction, or whether the German government is failing to use its leverage on Israel and protect the humanitarian rights of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And as you said, I think what you have to consider is that Germany has really become an immigrant country. So a fourth of the people living in Germany have some sort of migration background. And there's roughly 5 million people in Germany who have a Muslim background. We have 1.2 Syrians living in Germany, or people with who come from Syrian families. 3 million are of Turkish descent, so that's also a very large group that traditionally sympathizes more with the Palestinian cause than with Israel. We also know from surveys that among the Muslim population and the migrant population in Germany, unfortunately, anti-Semitism is much more prevalent than in the rest of German society, and it's already high in the rest of German society too. I don't want to, exclude the Germans from that. It's the level is too high too, but it's even higher in the migrant and Muslim groups. So we've seen both political statements, but also just anger playing out. Right, the first weekend, we've seen riots in Neukölln with cars burning and police being attacked and several people being arrested. And this just continues. We've just seen another riot in Neukölln, which is an area with a lot of Arab population, or Muslim population in Berlin. But it's also in other large German cities. We've seen pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Frankfurt and Stuttgart. And I should mention that many of them did remain peaceful, but others did not. And then, of course, you have threats to the Jewish community in Germany, to community centers, synagogues, schools, also schools and TV stations not related to Jewish life. There are, many are under special police surveillance. Individual Jewish Germans have been threatened. Doors in Berlin being marked with the Star of David. So it's just a really tense atmosphere. And then many debates, of course, in the academic community. We've just seen the Frankfurt Book Fair and the opening statement by the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, which I personally did not think was that problematic. What he did condemn the terrorist attacks, but also said that the conflict needed some sort of contextualization. And I think that's the great debate that we also see in the US and in Germany. How much is contextualizing the conflict, relativizing the atrocities that we've seen, or is it okay to contextualize in order to give some better understanding? And that's what's playing out in many very different ways here in Germany too.
Yeah, Steve, do you have anything to add to that? I mean,
well,
you were away, but I mean, you're a
well, I've been here before.
Kenna of Germany, and you know the context, right?
Well, look, I mean, when I think of Germany and Israel, I think Germany is probably next to America and Egypt, which keeps the peace, the third most important ally Israel has, just because of the past, but also because I think Germany does also recognize Israel plays an important role. It's a democracy. I don't want to overdo it, but Germany does have a big voice in Israel that is listened to. And I'm sure Chancellor Scholz was fairly early to come. I'm sure he said privately, he tends to say things privately to the Israelis, look, don't go overboard here. Pay attention to reaction. And I think the French have the same issues. They have more Muslims as a percentage of their population than anywhere in Western Europe, and they're struggling. There have been attacks. There have been, it's just very, very difficult when people see the conflict as is almost inevitable as one of oppression and colonization. And it's very easy to see it that way. It's not wrong entirely to see it that way either. There is colonization, there is oppression, but there's also the right of Israel to exist as a sovereign state within its borders and to defend itself. And the tension of those things, I think, is really, really, really strong. And you know, I have no answer for it, but I mean, it's I think very uncomfortable for governments to manage this, as it is for Arab governments to manage the anger in their own streets. As a journalist, we can watch and analyze, but it's obviously complicated, schwer.
Yeah, and I think, if I may add, I think it's you've mentioned France, and I think numbers-wise, it's a much more contentious situation there. In Germany, it's very difficult because of our particular commemoration culture. And we've talked about how Germany's commemoration culture might change due to generational change and also due to Germany becoming a multi-ethnic society. And I think now it's the first time it really plays out, because what we've seen, a call we've seen, or a chant we've seen during demonstrations, for example, last week in front of the foreign ministry, is the chant "Free Palestine from German guilt." And I think that's something that older generations really have to deal with. And we've had a great demonstration of solidarity just this weekend. President Steinmeier spoke there, and he spoke there in this very traditional German language of reconciliation and Germany's dedication to the state of Israel. But when you looked at the crowd, and there were about 10,000 people there, it was mostly the older generation who came. So we see the younger generation, the Fridays for Future, the young Palestinian youth, and many left-wing groups who have younger members and sympathize with the Palestinians. We see them in a very different traditions, more in the traditions even you have mentioned, of viewing this as a colonial or post-colonial conflict. And I think that's something that's really being discussed out in the open and very prominently for the first time now in this country. And then, of course, it's mixed up with other domestic debates too. We've just had a large debate on migration here in Germany. German municipalities are overwhelmed by the flow of immigrants coming to the country right now. And this is now also by the Christian Democrats, by Friedrich Merz just today in a newspaper article, as being linked to the new tensions we see in the streets, saying, well, this is, look at the anti-Semitism that is coming with migrants to Germany. And this is just another reason why we have to limit migration to Germany. So it's being interlinked too.
Yeah, I would say I was also rather upset by the Frankfurt Book Fair, because I've read this novel, Minor Detail. I read it a year ago. It's a very good novel. I mean, I don't see why it's created all this terrible fuss, but I'm just sorry, because you know, I believe in free speech, and I believe in the right of writers to write, and I understand the pain of it, but in a way, I shouldn't talk about it. I should know more about what actually happened. But I mean, for people to see this as a sort of dangerous work, I think is simply wrong.
But a bit of a segue from there. I mean, Anna, you had a piece in Die ZEIT on Wednesday where you talked about, you know, the importance of freedom to assemble, but also that hate speech just cannot be accepted, right? And I certainly found in that article you're looking at exactly this tension that we're talking about. Since we're talking about the paper, right, Katja, there are a couple of media-related questions. I don't know if you want to pose those.
I can pose this, and they go back to these ideological differences that we just discussed. So one viewer is asking, is it correct that the European media has covered Palestinian casualties with considerably more focus than the US media? And if so, does this reflect a different EU reaction? I don't know who wants to.
Well, I would say I've been a little busy, so I haven't been reading everything, but looking at the New York Times, Washington Post, I think looking at American television, I think there's been an enormous amount of coverage of Palestinian casualties, and I suspect there may be a different emphasis, you know, I don't know, but in terms of coverage, no, I mean, we're writing about Gaza 3 times a day, and we have people there, and we are paying a lot of attention to it. But I haven't compared these things.
And Steve, you just came back from the region. Another viewer asked, how do you even report from Gaza? I mean, it's so difficult sort of to get into it. So what I'm reporting is, of course, a general question, but can you just explain a little bit like how to work for journalists right now reporting accurately from Gaza?
It's very, very difficult. I mean, in previous Gaza incursions, you could get in. At one point, I think 2012, Israel shut Erez and then realized that was a mistake and let journalists in again in 2014. I once got arrested in Rafah, Egypt, trying to go through a tunnel into Rafah, Gaza, when things were shut. So no, I mean, it is a really serious problem. First of all, we have, I mean, I'll just talk about us, the New York Times. I mean, we have in the Jerusalem Bureau a Syrian-American excellent reporter who speaks Arabic and writes in English. We have people inside Gaza who are Gazans and non-Gazans, but who are Muslims working for us, photographers. We have been trying to get Western journalists into Gaza, but Egypt won't let anyone in. And at the moment, the Israelis won't let anybody in. So in a way, we're kind of stuck, but we're talking to people in Gaza every day. We're writing their stories. We have people trying to check the spinning coming from both sides about numbers of deaths, casualties. What's the truth? I mean, it can keep 100 people busy just trying to separate out what's propaganda from what's reality. And, you know, we've been trying to write about the daily lives of Gazans by talking to them and talking to our photographers there and to our stringers there and downloading them and putting these things into stories. But it is really difficult. I remember once just, you know, this is not now, but at one point being unable to get in, and I had a very good person who had a full-time contract with us, who was a Gazan, and I would just talk to her twice a day and download her and write stories under her name with a Gaza dateline just to get that side of the story in. It's getting harder in the West Bank too, by the way, because there's quite a lot of anger there, both among settler youth and among Palestinians. It's just become very tense everywhere. And it's not a satisfactory answer, but that's what we're doing.
Anna, what about for you at DIE ZEIT and in the German media? I mean, I think it has to be a concern for everyone, right? How are we getting accurate reporting from there when it's hard to get in and get out? I mean, obviously there are other means of communication.
Yes, but it's still, of course, it's still better to have reporters on the ground. And we've had several reporters in Israel. We are lucky to have a couple of people, particularly our Middle East correspondent who's very experienced in the region, who's traveled to the Gaza Strip at several occasions during the past years. I think she was there 6 months ago for the last time. And she's got, of course, many contacts, just as Steven said, Gazans who have worked for us, whom we can trust, whom we know. And who we can trust to get the information from. But when it comes to figures, when it comes to questions like what has really been destroyed, were there Hamas fighters or Hamas weapons hidden in certain buildings or not? It's really hard to verify from the outside. So we do talk to many Gazans too every day. We have reported on that for ZEIT Online. We will have a major story probably in the next edition of the ZEIT reporting on the humanitarian situation and the diplomatic battle for getting humanitarian aid in. But still, it feels, we would hope that we get some access too. Yeah. And I think when it comes to the quantity of reporting on the Israeli victims in Gaza, my sense is, and I can't of course quantify that, but my sense is that Germany has very much focused on the Israeli victims of the terrorist attacks, and it's really been a lot of coverage on individual families and their stories, and is now only just beginning to look more at the other side of the fence.
Thank you for that. We only have about 10 minutes left, but I really want to sort of widen the aperture of our conversation and try to put this in the broader geopolitical context and sort of tease out a little bit of what's happening. I certainly found it a little bit jarring to observe that in the same week that world leaders like President Biden and Chancellor Scholz took trips to Israel to show their steadfast support for Israel, Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing to tout his partnership with Xi. And so I'd be really interested in hearing from both of you how you see this fitting into the broader context. Steve, you, I guess about a week or so ago, had a piece and you contrasted Washington's support for Israel against Hamas with, on the one hand, with the Chinese and Russian efforts to align with the Palestinian struggle on the other. And I think, in that article, you talked a little bit about the role that Iran plays in all of this. I'd be very interested in hearing you talk a little bit about the axis between China, Russia, and Iran, and sort of Iran's role in what's going on right now.
Well, these are really good questions, and I'll try to be brief. Obviously, Russia doesn't have a real role in this conflict, but it is very good at pressing the button of unhappiness with Israel and anger at Israel and support for the Palestinians' right to a state and the Palestinians' right to live and breathe and so on and so on. And Russia and China have been very good at saying, we need to step in, we need a ceasefire. The US is vetoing resolutions. Of course, Russia is being rather cynical because it's doing in Ukraine worse things, I would say, than Israel's doing inside Gaza. But, and it is fighting a recolonization war in Ukraine, but never mind. I mean, it's an easy target for the Russians. And the Chinese can act like, well, we're power and we can be an honest broker. And isn't this all a terrible pity? I mean, just very struck by Iran getting invited into the BRICS movement before this happened, which was pretty surprising to me. This was very much a Russia-Chinese kind of anti-US Treasury Department's sanctions front, I would call it. But, in the effort to say that the Western-dominated system is unfair to emerging countries, Iran, which has very few allies, but has put itself on the side of Russia in Ukraine, is selling them huge amounts of drones, weapons, etc. It's a very odd group, but Iran is there. Now, in the region itself, it's very complicated because Iran wants to be a hegemon. It's not an Arab country. And the rest of the Sunni Arab world wants to keep Iran down. It's terrified of a nuclear-armed Iran, of a powerful Iran. It doesn't like Iran's cat's paws, which includes Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah. Iran's very active in Syria on the behalf of Bashar al-Assad, along with Russia. So I think in general, there's a quiet wish on the part of the Sunni Gulf states that Hamas get clobbered and Iran's power be diminished. But it's very hard for them to say so. And in general, it just seems to me Russia and China are just trying to get the propaganda advantage of not being America, not being Israel, and being ideally on the side of the repressed and the oppressed.
So I'd like to maybe pick up on that propaganda advantage that you were talking about, Steve, and ask you, Anna, how realistic you think it is that Beijing thinks it's in a position to play an honest broker. I mean, we've seen it try to do that in the conflict in Ukraine, to serve as an interlocutor between Kyiv and Moscow. And we've heard some noises about Beijing trying to position itself to do the same thing in this case. Is that anything that we should be watching and paying attention to?
I don't think so. The 12-point Chinese peace plan for Ukraine was really just the talking points. I mean, we've seen several. We've seen a special Chinese envoy traveling to the region, also to several EU capitals for conversations. But from all we hear from European diplomats from those conversations is that they just rattled down the 12 points basically, and there is no idea how to really implement those points, or no idea what leverage to use on Russia to implement those points. And I mean, it would mean in the Ukraine conflict that the Chinese would be able to put pressure on both sides. And I don't see that. And I don't see that either in this conflict. I mean, China does have good relations with some of the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, but that doesn't really help because it would need good relations, particularly with Israel, which it somewhat has. But I think that other players such as the US or also Germany are in a much better position to be a mediator if the hostilities stop at some point and we work towards a more sustainable solution.
I mean, I would say one other little advantage, for Russia is that it just takes attention away from Ukraine.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be a very hard winter in Ukraine. I mean, I wrote a story a little while ago about have we reached peak Ukraine in terms of support. I think we have done, not just in America, but inside Europe too. And this worries me a lot because, frankly, what happens in Ukraine, whether Russia perceives to have won somehow or not, is a lot more important geopolitically, it seems to me, than what happens in Gaza. Now, that may sound cold, but that's what I think.
Yeah, and there's a competition for the same funds the United States Congress has to release, both for Israeli military help and Ukrainian military help. So the money's not endless. And of course, the same weapon system too, in part. Israel needs Patriot systems and Ukraine needs Patriot systems.
Steven, you just said propaganda, and I'm just curious. So it looks like part of that, what you call propaganda, is also directed to the global South, who has been critical of Western approaches towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a while. So how do you think this plays out? Because there seems to be another layer in international relations. It's not just about this conflict. It's about who can write the rules of the international rules-based order, or about of the international order. And that seems to be the almost like the bigger issue at stake. I don't know, we have 3 minutes. Do you want to very quickly comment on that?
Well, I think you're right to raise the question. I mean, I don't think we know yet. I mean, there's a lot of sympathy in the global South, which by itself is North-South, I don't know, but there are a lot of Muslims in the global South, and there are a lot of people who feel that America, particularly since the Iraq War, has put itself in the wrong places and is seen as somehow on the side of the elites and not the growing world. So I think that's a real issue. Economically, it's different, I think. I mean, the BRICS, for the moment, seem incoherent to me. It's really China. It's China's power. Russia's much weaker, it seems to me, now than 2 years ago. And economically, I think it's going to be very hard to change the world order. But what you can do is block it from working, which they're very good at doing inside the UN and inside the Security Council and the US, partly inside the WTO. The big problem is these institutions aren't functioning. And that creates a vacuum. I don't know what fills that vacuum beyond chaos and countries doing whatever hell they feel like doing.
Anna, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree. This is just another conflict showing the blockade of the Security Council at the moment where it would really be needed. And I'm not sure the Russian propaganda is really going to work out on the ground in many of these countries. I surely do hope it does not. And we see large countries like India sort of taking a middle position because they are somewhat dependent on their good relations with the United States and Europe at the same time as they're dependent on good relations with Russia. And of course, a certain sympathy maybe for the post-colonial narrative. It won't be easy. It's not as clearly divided as Russia might want the West to think, but they certainly do have a point, and it certainly does resonate with many of the governments in the so-called global South.
Thank you so much. So I know we've come to the end, and there is so much we could have talked about. I mean, we certainly could deepen the discussion about the UN, and we had this. There's this controversy about Guterres' remarks. Of course, all of that kind of is also maybe a symbol for how difficult it is at the United Nations to move ahead. We also, Stephen, you started with saying it is so difficult. What's going to happen in Gaza after, after the incursion, if an incursion happens, and even if Israel is successful in diminishing Hamas, what comes after that? And I think that's a whole different and other discussion, and that also, of course, fuels these emotions and sentiments. So with that, I just want to give you each 30 seconds to maybe touch on that, or to come back to something that you wanted to elaborate further, just for like a closing remark from each of you.
Anna, do you want to go first?
Yes, that's the hardest part. I mean, the options for what happens in Gaza, I think, are sort of on the table, and none of them are really good. So it could be an ongoing Israeli occupation, which Israel has already tried and found very difficult and very harmful. It could be put under international administration, which would be a good idea, but which probably both sides wouldn't agree to. It could fall back under some sort of Palestinian administration, which the other Palestinian authorities are probably not capable of doing, really. So I don't really have a good idea. I think the only thing that I would really like to emphasize is that I would hope that my country, Germany, would step up and see that it could play a very good and valuable role in this conflict. And it has neglected this in the past, but I think it would now be in an even better positioned to do so. We've built relations with many of the Gulf states, particularly because we needed their gas during the past year. But this has had a stabilizing and deepening effect on our relations with some of the countries in the regions that are now really important, like Qatar. So we can talk to both sides, and I think they should try that.
That's really good. I would say that my hope is that this will, as the French say, changer les donnes, that it would change the assumptions, change the atmosphere. I think only the Americans can pick up the pieces from this war and push for a better political settlement for the Palestinians, West Bank, Gaza. Biden talks about the two-state solution. Maybe he can push it forward in some fashion. Gaza, I say, you know, it's a big issue. I mean, the UN still has legal authority, which it didn't operate since 1996, in the UNSO, which is the Truce Supervision Organization. One can imagine, at least for a time, international peacekeepers. I doubt Arab countries would want to be part of that, but maybe NATO countries would. That would be unusual, and set up some kind of system inside Gaza. But in the end, somebody's got to run it. And what I really worry about is Israel, once this is all over, if it's ever over, I think it's going to take months, by the way, is just going to build an even wider security zone, even inside Gaza, and build a real wall and wash its hands again and just go back to containment in a more serious way, and say to the rest of the world, we're out of there. It's not our problem. But we'll see. Inshallah, it will all come out nicely.
You know, I'd like to really thank both of you for these very thoughtful closing remarks after an hour of very thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. You know, Steve, listening to you just now, I have a sense of optimism that maybe the two-state solution is not as far away. I was speaking with somebody earlier this week who's an analyst of Israel, and he was saying that's got to be postponed for at least 10 years after this current situation of violence that we're seeing unfold, and he had no hope for it. So it's helpful to me to hear you say that maybe this is something that's not off the table. And Anna, I think your closing comment about Germany really being in a position to step up and do more is a very important one, because as one looks around the world, there are not a lot of countries that are in a position to actually do something. I think, if anything, this conflict that we're seeing has revealed but also exacerbated some of the deep divisions within, but also among EU member states. And the big question that I have is, does this conflict in Gaza ultimately make Europe more vulnerable? And I think the answer at the end of the day is yes, it does. But that's something that maybe we'll have another opportunity to unpack a little bit more. For now, I just really want to thank you both, Anna and Steve. This has been an incredibly thoughtful conversation that we've had at a very difficult time. So herzlichen Dank to both of you in Berlin. We appreciate it greatly that you've taken the time to do this. And on behalf of both 1014 and the ACG, of course, also many thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. And as always, thank you for submitting some great questions. We're happy we were able to accommodate some of them, but sorry we didn't get to all of them.
Thank you.